On the 20 slides shown below, I present the original photographs of the Second World War from the German archive, which are in my collection. These photos are from my collection department, Wehrmacht on the Eastern and Western Fronts. If you like it, subscribe to my YouTube, like it, so you don't miss the new weekly presentations. If you would like to order 5 inches by 7 inches copies of these photos from the original, you can specify which photos you would like to receive. Laboratory quality. Enjoy your viewing. Poland was home to Europe's largest pre-war Jewish population on the eve of the Holocaust, some 3.5 million Jews, most of whom were murdered. The Polish state preserves sites like the ghetto and the Auschwitz death camp, while also honoring the massive losses inflicted on the entire nation. Some 6 million Polish citizens were killed during the war, about 3 million of them Jews and the others mostly Christian Poles. The Warsaw Ghetto initially held some 380,000 Jews who were cramped into tight living spaces, and at its peak housed about 500,000 people. Disease and starvation were rampant, and bodies often appeared on the streets. The Jewish resistance movement in the ghetto grew after 265,000 men, women and children were rounded up in the summer of 1942 and killed at the Treblinka death camp. As word of the Nazi genocide spread, those who remained behind no longer believed German promises they would be sent to labor camps. Before World War II, the majority of Polish Jews lived in the merchant districts of Muranów, Powązki, and Stara Praga. Over 90% of Catholics lived further away from the commercial center. The Jewish community was the most prominent there, constituting over 88% of the inhabitants of Muranów, with the total of about 32.7% of the population of the left bank and 14.9% of the right bank Warsaw, or 332,938 people in total according to 1931 census. The Warsaw Ghetto, German, Warsaw Ghetto, officially Jüdischer Wohnbezirk in Warsaw, Jewish residential district in Warsaw, Polish, Ghetto Warszawskie, was the largest of the Nazi ghettos during World War II and the Holocaust. It was established in November 1940 by the German authorities within the new general government territory of occupied Poland. At its height, as many as 460,000 Jews were imprisoned there, in an area of 3.4 square kilometers, 1.3 square miles, with an average of 9.2 persons per room, barely subsisting on meager food rations. By the end of the September campaign, the number of Jews in and around the capital increased dramatically, with thousands of refugees escaping the Polish-German front. In less than a year, the number of refugees in Warsaw exceeded 90,000. On October 12, 1939, the general government was established by Adolf Hitler in the occupied area of central Poland. The Nazi-appointed Jewish Council, Judenrat, in Warsaw, a committee of 24 people headed by Adam Chiniaków, was responsible for carrying out German orders. On October 26, the Jews were mobilized as forced laborers to clear bomb damage and perform other hard labor. 1 month later, on November 20, the bank accounts of Polish Jews and any deposits exceeding 2,000 ZL were blocked. On November 23, all Jewish establishments were ordered to display a Jewish star on doors and windows. Beginning December 1, all Jews older than 10 were compelled to wear a white armband, and on December 11, they were forbidden from using public transit. On January 26, 1940, the Jews were banned from holding communal prayers due to the risk of spreading epidemics. Food stamps were introduced by the German authorities, and measures were stepped up to liquidate all Jewish communities in the vicinity of Warsaw intensified. The Jewish population of the capital reached 359,827 before the end of the year. On the orders of Warsaw District Governor Ludwig Fischer, the ghetto wall construction started on April 1, 1940, circling the area of Warsaw inhabited predominantly by Jews. The work was supervised by the Warsaw Judenrat. The Nazi authorities expelled 113,000 ethnic Poles from the neighborhood, and ordered the relocation of 138,000 Warsaw Jews from the suburbs into the city center. On October 16, 1940, the creation of the ghetto was announced by the German Governor-General, Hans Frank. The initial population of the ghetto was 450,000, confined to an area of 307 hectares, 3.07 square kilometers. Before the Holocaust began, the number of Jews imprisoned there was between 375,000 and 400,000, about 30% of the general population of the capital. The area of the ghetto constituted only about 2.4% of the overall metropolitan area. Warsaw Ghetto Wall and footbridge over Klodna Street in 1942. Corner of Żelazna 70 and Klodna 23, looking east. This section of Żelazna Street connected the large ghetto and small ghetto areas of German-occupied Warsaw. The Germans closed the Warsaw Ghetto to the outside world on November 15, 1940. The wall around it was 3 meters, 9.8 feet, high and topped with barbed wire. Escapees were shot on sight. German policemen from Battalion 61 used to hold victory parties on the days when a large number of prisoners were shot at the ghetto fence. The borders of the ghetto changed and its overall area was gradually reduced, as the captive population was decreased by outbreaks of infectious diseases, mass hunger, and regular executions. The ghetto was divided in two along Klodna Street: ulica Klodna w Warszawie, which was excluded from it, due to its local importance at that time, as one of Warsaw's east-west thoroughfares. The area southeast of Klodna was known as the Small Ghetto, while the area north of it became known as the Large Ghetto. The two zones were connected at an intersection of Klodna with Żelazna Street, where a special gate was built. In January 1942, the gate was removed and a wooden footbridge was built over it, which became one of the post-war symbols of the Holocaust in occupied Poland. The first commissioner of the Warsaw Ghetto, appointed by Fischer, was Ssstanddartenführer Aldemar Schön, who also supervised the initial Jewish relocations in 1940. He was an attritionist best known for orchestrating an artificial famine, Künstliche Hungersnot, in January 1941. Schön had eliminated virtually all food supplies to the ghetto, causing an uproar among the SS upper echelon. He was relieved of his duties by Frank himself in March 1941 and replaced by Commissar Heinz Auerswald, a productionist who served until November 1942. Like in all Nazi ghettos across occupied Poland, the Germans ascribed the internal administration to a Judenrat Council of the Jews, led by an Ältester, the eldest. In Warsaw, this role was relegated to Adamczyn Yaków, who chose a policy of collaboration with the Nazis in the hope of saving lives. Adamczyn Yaków confided his harrowing experience in 9 diaries. In July 1942, when the Germans ordered him to increase the contingent of people to be deported, he committed suicide. Nazi officials, intent on eradicating the ghetto by hunger and disease, limited food and medical supplies. An average daily food ration in 1941 for Jews in Warsaw was limited to 184 calories, compared to 699 calories allowed for Gentile Poles and 2,613 calories for the Germans. In August, the rations fell to 177 calories per person. This meager food supply by the German authorities usually consisted of dry bread, flour and potatoes of the lowest quality, carrots, turnips, and a small monthly supplement of margarine, sugar, and meat. As a result, black market economy thrived, supplying as much as 80% of the ghetto's food. In addition, the joint had opened over 250 soup kitchens, which served at one time as many as 100,000 meals per day. Men, women and children all took part in smuggling and illegal trade, and private workshops were created to manufacture goods to be sold secretly on the Aryan side of the city. Foodstuffs were often smuggled by children alone, who crossed the ghetto wall by the hundreds in any way possible, sometimes several times a day, returning with goods that could weigh as much as they did. Unemployment leading to extreme poverty was a major problem in the ghetto, and smuggling was often the only source of subsistence for the ghetto inhabitants, who would have otherwise died of starvation. Professional smugglers, in contrast, often became relatively wealthy. Despite grave hardships, life in the Warsaw Ghetto had educational and cultural activities, both legal and those conducted by its underground organizations. Hospitals, public soup kitchens, orphanages, refugee centers and recreation facilities were formed, as well as a school system. Some schools were illegal and operated under the guise of soup kitchens. There were secret libraries, classes for the children and even a symphony orchestra. Rabbi Alexander Friedman, Secretary General of Agudath Israel of Poland, was one of the Torah leaders in the Warsaw Ghetto. He organized an underground network of religious schools, including a Yesidei HaTorah school for boys, a Bar Is Yaakov school for girls, a school for elementary Jewish instruction, and 3 institutions for advanced Jewish studies. These schools, operating under the guise of kindergartens, medical centers and soup kitchens, were a place of refuge for thousands of children and teens, and hundreds of teachers. In 1941, when the Germans gave official permission to the local Judenrat to open schools, these schools came out of hiding and began receiving financial support from the official Jewish community. Former Cinema Femina became a theater in this period. The Jewish Symphonic Orchestra performed in several venues, including Femina. On January 18, 1943, after almost 4 months without deportations, the Germans suddenly entered the Warsaw Ghetto intent upon further roundups. Within hours, some 600 Jews were shot and 5,000 others removed from their residences. The Germans expected no resistance, but the action was brought to a halt by hundreds of insurgents armed with handguns and Molotov cocktails. April 19, 1943, when a Nazi force consisting of several thousand troops entered the ghetto. After initial setbacks, 2,000 Waffen-SS soldiers under the field command of Jürgen Stroop systematically burned and blew up the ghetto buildings, block by block, rounding up or murdering anybody they could capture. Significant resistance ended on April 28, and the Nazi operation officially ended in mid-May, symbolically culminating with the demolition of the Great Synagogue of Warsaw on May 16. According to the official report, at least 56,065 people were killed on the spot or deported to German Nazi concentration and death camps, Treblinka, Poniatowa, Majdanek, Trawnicki. The site of the ghetto became the Warsaw concentration camp. Jürgen Stroop, born Joseph Stroop, the 26th of September 1895, the 6th of March 1952, was a German SS commander during the Nazi era, who served as SS and police leader in occupied Poland and Greece. He led the suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto uprising in 1943 and wrote the Stroop Report, a book-length account of the operation. Following the defeat of Germany, Stroop was prosecuted during the Dachau trials and convicted of murdering 9 U.S. prisoners of war. After his extradition to Poland, Stroop was tried, convicted, and executed for crimes against humanity. Karl Heinrich Clausemeier, the 22nd of February 1914, the 21st of April 1976, was a member of the Nazi Party who served in the Gestapo, NSKK, and SA. During World War II, he was stationed in the Warsaw Ghetto, where he personally murdered multiple Jewish civilians and participated in the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising. After the war, he settled down in West Germany. Clausemeier was investigated by German prosecutors and arrested in the early 1960s. In 1965, he was found guilty of war crimes and sentenced to life in prison by the Bielefeld Regional Court. He was released from prison in 1976 on compassionate grounds due to terminal cancer and died less than 2 weeks later. Joseph Bloch, the 12th of February 1912, the 29th of July 1969, was a member of the Nazi Party who served in the SS and SD during World War II. Bloch shot and killed many Jews, and helped send many more Jews to their deaths in extermination camps. He also participated in several massacres. He was subsequently located by the East German Stasi and arrested on the 11th of January 1967. Bloch was convicted of numerous atrocities and sentenced to death by the Erfurt Regional Court. He was executed in Leipzig on the 29th of July 1969. Approximately 100,000 ghetto inmates had already died of hunger-related diseases and starvation before the mass deportations started in the summer of 1942. Earlier that year, during the Wannsee Conference near Berlin, the final solution was set in motion. It was a secretive plan to mass murder Jewish inhabitants of the general government. The techniques used to deceive victims were based upon experience gained at the Helmnow extermination camp, Kulmhof. The ghettoized Jews were rounded up, street by street, under the guise of resettlement, and marched to the Umschlagplatz holding area. From there, they were sent aboard Holocaust trains to the Treblinka death camp, built in a forest 80 kilometers, 50 miles, northeast of Warsaw. The operation was headed by the German Resettlement Commissioner, SS Sturmbannführer Hermann Höfler, on behalf of Sammon Frankenegg. Upon learning of this plan, Adam Chernyakhov, leader of the Judenrat Council, committed suicide. He was replaced by Marek Lichtenbaum, tasked with managing roundups with the aid of Jewish ghetto police. No one was informed about the real state of affairs. The Warsaw Ghetto Uprising of 1943 took place over a year before the Warsaw Uprising of 1944. The ghetto had been totally destroyed by the time of the general uprising in the city, which was part of the Operation Tempest, a nationwide insurrection plan. During the Warsaw Uprising, the Polish Home Army's Battalion Zośka was able to rescue 380 Jewish prisoners, mostly foreign, held in the concentration camp Ghettowka set up by the Germans in an area adjacent to the ruins of former ghetto. These prisoners had been brought from Auschwitz and forced to clear the remains of the ghetto. A few small groups of ghetto residents also managed to survive in the undetected bunkers and to eventually reach the Aryan side. In all, several hundred survivors from the first uprising took part in the later uprising, mostly in non-combat roles such as logistics and maintenance, due to their physical state and general shortage of arms, joining the ranks of the Polish Home Army and the Armia Ludowa. According to Samuel Krakowski from the Jewish Historical Institute, the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising had a real influence in encouraging the activity of the Polish underground. For 8 weeks, the deportations of Jews from Warsaw to Treblinka continued on a daily basis via 2 shuttle trains, each transport carrying about 4,000 to 7,000 people crying for water, 100 people to a cattle truck. The first daily trains rolled into the camp early in the morning, often after an overnight wait at a layover yard, and the second, in mid-afternoon. Dr. Janusz Korczak, a famed educator, went to Treblinka with his orphanage children in August 1942. He was offered a chance to escape by Polish friends and admirers, but he chose instead to share the fate of his life's work. All new arrivals were sent immediately to the undressing area by the Sonderkommando squad that managed the arrival platform, and from there to the gas chambers. The stripped victims were suffocated to death in batches of 200 with the use of monoxide gas. In September 1942, new gas chambers were built, which could kill as many as 3,000 people in just 2 hours. Civilians were forbidden to approach the camp area. In the last 2 weeks of the action ending on September 21, 1942, some 48,000 Warsaw Jews are deported to their deaths. For 8 weeks, the deportations of Jews from Warsaw to Treblinka continued on a daily basis via 2 shuttle trains, each transport carrying about 4,000 to 7,000 people crying for water, 100 people to a cattle truck. The first daily trains rolled into the camp early in the morning, often after an overnight wait at a layover yard, and the second, in mid-afternoon. Dr. Janusz Korczak, a famed educator, went to Treblinka with his orphanage children in August 1942. He was offered a chance to escape by Polish friends and admirers, but he chose instead to share the fate of his life's work. All new arrivals were sent immediately to the undressing area by the Sonderkommando squad that managed the arrival platform, and from there to the gas chambers. The stripped victims were suffocated to death in batches of 200 with the use of monoxide gas. In September 1942, new gas chambers were built, which could kill as many as 3,000 people in just 2 hours. Civilians were forbidden to approach the camp area. In the last 2 weeks of the Aktion ending on September 21, 1942, some 48,000 Warsaw Jews are deported to their deaths. The living conditions in the ghetto were very difficult. Density of population was extreme. There were 146,000 people per square kilometer, which meant 8 to 10 people per room on average. Jews from other districts of Warsaw as well as those from other cities were allowed to bring only the absolute minimum with them, usually personal belongings and bedclothes. That meant instant poverty and great social disadvantage in comparison with original inhabitants of the ghetto's pre-war district. But in general only a very small percentage of the ghetto population had any kind of regular employment or any other source of income. Street trading became a necessity for many and anything could be a subject of exchange. Israel Gutman estimates that around 20,000 prisoners, out of more than 400,000, remained at the top of ghetto society, either because they were wealthy before the war, or because they were able to amass wealth during it, mainly through smuggling. Those families and individuals frequented restaurants, clubs and cafes, showing in stark contrast the economic inequalities of ghetto life. WWII estimates that group at around 10,000 people, rich industrialists, many Judenrat council leaders, Jewish police officers, profiteering smugglers, nightclub owners, and high-end prostitutes who were spending their time at over 60 cafes and nightclubs, dancing among the corpses. Children starving to death. Between 1940 and mid-1942, 83,000 Jews died of starvation and disease. Widespread smuggling of food and medicines into the ghetto supplemented the miserable official allotments and kept the death rate from increasing still further. It was necessary for people in the ghettos to find work to be able to buy food, but also because the factories or other working places provided them with a bowl of soup. A necessary condition to survive, however, was the ability to supplement the official starvation rations by buying extra food on the black market, where the prices were many times higher than the official ones. Those who were not able to do so were sentenced to death by starvation. Beggars populated the ghetto streets, trying to get some food in order to be saved for one more day. Little children with rags instead of clothes cried for a piece of bread. The streets were crowded with all those poor people running around or selling their last belongings, almost all their household items and clothes. As the war effort continued, the need for cheap, and preferably free, labor increased. The Nazis increasingly turned to utilizing the incarcerated Jews for forced labor such as construction work. By the summer of 1940, the Jewish Council in Warsaw was asked to supply lists of able-bodied Jewish men to work in labor camps. Failure to supply the amount of men asked for resulted in random roundups of Jewish men in the streets. Conditions in the camps were abysmal, and workers sent there would often die as a result of the lethal conditions, or return back to the ghetto scarred by their experiences. Workers were not paid for their efforts. Life in the ghettos was usually unbearable. Overcrowding was common. One apartment might have several families living in it. Plumbing broke down, and human waste was thrown in the streets along with the garbage. Contagious diseases spread rapidly in such cramped, unsanitary housing. People were always hungry. Germans deliberately tried to starve residents by allowing them to purchase only a small amount of bread, potatoes, and fat. Some residents had some money or valuables they could trade for food smuggled into the ghetto, others were forced to beg or steal to survive. Despite unbearable living conditions and hardships, the inhabitants of the ghetto continued to engage in creative intellectual work. The Nazi occupation forced scientists, artists, and representatives of other creative professions to rethink their lives and try to express the catastrophe that has swept the world through art. Underground libraries, the underground archive Onig Shabbat worked in the ghetto, and youth movements were active. There was even a symphony orchestra. Books, studies, music and theater allowed people to switch off from the gloomy reality at least for a while, reminded them of their former life. When moving to the ghetto, Jews were allowed to take only their personal belongings with them, other property was to be abandoned. The ghettos were overcrowded, officially issued food was not enough, there were no medicines. Starvation and disease led to high mortality. Against those who brought food into the ghetto, the Germans took harsh measures, up to and including execution. However, despite the inhuman conditions of existence, community institutions and volunteer organizations worked in the ghetto, which did their best to support its inhabitants and make their life easier. By creating a ghetto, the Nazis achieved several goals. They concentrated Jews in one place under strict control, confiscated their property, used their labor, the prisoners were isolated from the outside world, which made them easily vulnerable and made it impossible to resist. In addition, the occupiers incited the local population against the inhabitants of the ghetto, which was already unfriendly to the Jews. In total, the Germans created about 1,200 ghettos in Eastern Europe and several ghettos in Central and Southern Europe. During World War II, the Warsaw Ghetto was the largest in Europe. Before the war 375,000 Jews lived in Warsaw, representing 30% of the city's population. Immediately after the capitulation of Poland and the capture of its capital, the occupiers began to persecute the Jews, as well as actively use their labor in forced labor. In November 1939, the first anti-Jewish decree was passed requiring Jews to wear a white armband with a blue Star of David. The orders of the Nazi authorities that followed him deprived the Jews of their sources of livelihood. A Judenrat, Council of Elders, was chosen to govern the life of the Jewish community according to Nazi laws. Jews have lived in Poland for 800 years. On the eve of the German occupation, the Jewish community in Poland numbered 3,300,000 people. It was the largest in Europe and accounted for 10% of the total population of the country. When Germany and the USSR occupied Poland in September 1939, most of the Jews who found themselves in the zone of German occupation, 1,800,000 people, were gathered in the ghetto. After the German invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941, the same fate befell the Jews throughout occupied Poland. Thousands were sent to concentration camps and forced labor. After the war, only 380,000 Polish Jews remained alive. They were in Poland, the USSR, as well as in concentration camps in Germany and Austria. In Poland, only 10% of the Jewish population survived the Holocaust, with most of them escaping in the Soviet Union. The fate of the Jews of Western Europe developed in different ways. In some states, the majority managed to survive, as, for example, in Italy and France, where about 25% of the Jews died. In other Western European countries, a significant part of the Jews was destroyed. In Belgium, 45% died. In Holland, more than 80% of the Jewish population. Most of the Jews of Slovakia, Hungary, Greece and Yugoslavia were also killed by the Germans and their accomplices, while 75% of the Jews under Bulgarian rule escaped.